What makes a man step out of a burning steel coffin into a storm of enemy fire with nothing but a rifle? In the scorching desert sands of North Africa, where tanks clashed like modern-day knights in a medieval tournament, one British soldier would answer that question with actions that defied every reasonable instinct for self-preservation. His name was Sergeant Charles Calistan, and on a blistering October afternoon in 1942, he would turn a moment of mechanical failure into one of the most audacious individual stands of the Second World War. The Second Battle of El Alamein would become known as the turning point of the North African campaign, the moment when Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army finally broke the back of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. History books would chronicle the grand strategies, the artillery barrages, the coordinated tank movements across hundreds of miles of desert. But within that massive clash of armies, there existed countless smaller battles, individual moments of courage or cowardice, brilliance or failure, that collectively determined the outcome of the larger conflict. This is the story of one such moment, when a tank gunner armed with nothing more than a personal weapon and an unshakable determination became the unlikely bulwark against a German counterattack that threatened to shatter the British lines. It is a story that begins not with the thunder of tank guns or the roar of aircraft engines, but with the quiet ridicule of fellow soldiers who could not understand why their comrade insisted on carrying something so seemingly useless into mechanized warfare. The Desert War had its own particular character, distinct from the fighting in Europe or the Pacific. It was a war of vast distances, where armies maneuvered across terrain that offered no natural obstacles, no cities to defend, no rivers to cross. Logistics became paramount. Fuel, water, ammunition, and spare parts determined what was tactically possible far more than strategic brilliance. Both sides fought at the end of impossibly long supply lines, with reinforcements and material arriving by ship and then traveling hundreds of miles by truck or rail to reach the front. The side that could maintain its supply flow while disrupting the enemies inevitably gained the advantage. For the British soldiers fighting in North Africa, the war had been a frustrating series of advances and retreats, victories that could not be exploited, and defeats that somehow did not become catastrophic. Rommel had proven himself a master of desert warfare, using his limited resources with such skill that he repeatedly defeated larger British forces. By late 1942, however, the balance had shifted. Montgomery had assumed command with orders to win decisively, and he had been given the time and resources to prepare properly. The offensive that began on October 23rd was the culmination of months of meticulous preparation. Charles Edward Calistan was born in the industrial heart of Birmingham in 1918, just as the Great War was drawing to its exhausting conclusion. He grew up in a Britain still bearing the scars of that conflict, where entire streets mourned their lost sons and fathers. The young Charles heard the stories, saw the maimed veterans, and absorbed the complex mixture of pride and horror that characterized British attitudes toward the First World War. Like many boys of his generation, he was simultaneously fascinated by tales of military valor and deeply aware of warfare's terrible cost. His father, Thomas Calistan, had served with the Birmingham Rifles on the Western Front, surviving 4 years of trench warfare that claimed most of his original battalion. Thomas rarely spoke of his experiences in detail, but young Charles absorbed the lessons his father did share. "A soldier's job is to stay alive long enough to accomplish the mission," Thomas would say. "Fancy equipment helps, but in the end it comes down to whether you can think clearly when everything's going wrong and whether you're willing to do what needs doing." The Calistan household was working class but stable. Thomas worked as a foreman in a munitions factory, a position that reflected both his technical skills and his reliability. Charles's mother, Margaret, managed the household with the efficiency of someone who had learned to stretch limited resources during the war years. She was fiercely proud of her family and instilled in her children the values of hard work, education, and service to community. Charles had 2 younger siblings, a brother who would eventually work in the family trade and a sister who became a teacher. Growing up in industrial Birmingham shaped Charles's worldview. He understood machinery intuitively, spending hours in his father's workshop, learning to repair everything from bicycles to clocks. He developed the methodical approach to problem solving that characterized good mechanics, diagnosing issues systematically, testing solutions, learning from failures. These skills would prove unexpectedly valuable in military service, where mechanical reliability often determined survival. By the time he enlisted in the Royal Tank Regiment in 1938, at the age of 20, The world was sliding inexorably toward another global catastrophe. The mechanization of warfare had transformed military thinking since 1918. Tanks, which had been cumbersome novelties in the First World War, had evolved into fast, powerful weapons that military theorists believed would dominate future battlefields. The German blitzkrieg tactics that would soon devastate Poland and France seemed to confirm this vision of mechanized supremacy. Calistan showed an immediate aptitude for gunnery. The interior of a tank was a cramped, noisy, uncomfortable environment where men worked in practiced coordination, each member of the crew absolutely dependent on the others. The gunner occupied a particularly critical position, responsible for identifying targets and delivering the main armament's devastating firepower with precision under combat conditions. It required steady nerves, excellent eyesight, quick reflexes, and the ability to function effectively while enclosed in what veterans darkly referred to as a moving crematorium. The training regimen for tank crews was intensive and comprehensive. Calistan learned to identify enemy vehicles by silhouette at extreme ranges, to calculate range and lead for moving targets, to maintain his equipment under field conditions, and to function as part of a coordinated crew. He excelled particularly in marksmanship, consistently achieving high scores during qualification exercises. His instructors noted his unusual calmness under pressure. His ability to maintain focus when simulated combat conditions created chaos around him. But Calistan possessed a quirk that set him apart from his fellow tankers and became something of a running joke within his unit. He insisted on carrying a Lee-Enfield rifle with him into battle, carefully stowing the weapon inside his Crusader tank despite the cramped conditions. To his comrades, this seemed absurdly pointless. What possible use could a bolt-action rifle serve when you were sealed inside several tons of armor, communicating with the world outside through periscopes and aiming a gun that could punch through steel at 1,000 yards? The mockery was gentle but persistent. "Planning to shoot down Stukas with that, Charlie?" his loader would tease. "Going to challenge Rommel to a duel?" the driver would add with a grin. Even his tank commander, Lieutenant James Holbrook, good-naturedly questioned the practice. "You do know we have machine guns mounted on the tank, Sergeant?" he would point out. Calistan's response was always the same quiet shrug and a simple explanation that satisfied no one. "You never know when you might need it, sir." His father had carried a rifle through the trenches of the Somme and survived when so many others had not. The weapon represented more than mere firepower to Calistan. It symbolized adaptability, the ability to keep fighting when circumstances stripped away all the advantages of technology and modern warfare. His father had taught him that in war, the moment you stopped being able to fight was often the moment you died. The journey to North Africa had been long and circuitous. Calistan's unit had spent months training in England before being shipped to Egypt via the Cape of Good Hope, the longer but safer route that avoided the U-boat-infested Mediterranean. The voyage gave the soldiers time to contemplate what awaited them. Veterans of earlier desert campaigns shared their experiences: the heat, the flies, the chronic shortage of water, the way sand infiltrated everything and required constant maintenance of equipment. They spoke of enemy soldiers who were professional and skilled, particularly the German Afrika Korps troops, who had earned grudging respect from their British opponents. Arriving in Egypt was a shock to soldiers who had never left Britain before. The exotic landscape, the ancient monuments, the bustling streets of Cairo, all of it was overwhelming and fascinating. But the soldiers had little time for tourism. They were quickly moved forward to training areas where they acclimatized to desert conditions and refined their tactics for the terrain they would fight in. The desert imposed its own rules on warfare. Tank engines overheated in the extreme temperatures. Sand clogged filters and wore down moving parts with abrasive efficiency. Navigation was challenging across featureless terrain where landmarks were scarce and mirages common. Water discipline became paramount. Men learned to function on rations that would have been considered inadequate in temperate climates. The sun was as much an enemy as the Germans, capable of inflicting casualties through heat stroke and dehydration if soldiers were not vigilant. This philosophy would be tested on October 27, 1942, at a desolate stretch of desert that held no particular strategic value beyond the fact that two armies happened to collide there. By this point in the North African campaign, both sides were exhausted. Rommel's Afrika Korps, though still formidable, was starved of fuel and supplies. Montgomery's 8th Army had spent months building up overwhelming numerical superiority in preparation for a decisive offensive. The battle that began on October 23rd was grinding, brutal, and costly. British tanks pushed forward through minefields and German defensive positions, taking terrible casualties but applying relentless pressure. The opening days of the offensive had been particularly difficult. Montgomery's plan called for infantry to clear lanes through the extensive German minefields, allowing armor to exploit the breakthrough. In practice, the execution was slower and costlier than expected. German defensive positions proved more resilient than intelligence had suggested. The Axis forces fought with the desperation of soldiers who understood they were facing a battle that could determine the entire campaign's outcome. Calistan's unit, part of the 9th Armored Brigade, had been committed to the fighting on the second day of the offensive. They had already lost several tanks to German anti-tank guns and mines. The crew had experienced the particular terror of near misses, the deafening clang of enemy shells striking their armor without penetrating, leaving everyone inside deaf and shaken, but alive. They had seen neighboring tanks brew up in sudden explosions of flame, knowing that their friends inside had mere seconds to escape before the ammunition cooked off and turned the vehicle into an inferno. The reality of tank combat bore little resemblance to the romantic notions that some soldiers had harbored before experiencing it firsthand. Inside the Crusader, the crew operated in a state of constant tension, knowing that a single well-placed shell could transform their vehicle from shelter into death trap in an instant. The noise was overwhelming. Engine roar, track clatter, shell detonations, machine gun fire, and radio communications all competing for attention. The heat was oppressive, with temperatures inside the tank often exceeding those outside. The smell of cordite, hot metal, sweat, and sometimes fear created an atmosphere that was physically nauseating until soldiers became accustomed to it. On the morning of October 27th, Calistan's crew received orders to advance toward a low ridge where German forces had established a defensive position anchored by several dug-in anti-tank guns and supported by infantry. Intelligence suggested the position was lightly held, part of a thinning German line that was beginning to show cracks under the sustained British pressure. The attack would involve a company of Crusader tanks moving forward together, with infantry following to secure any ground taken. What the intelligence had failed to identify was a small German mechanized unit positioned just behind the ridge, waiting to launch a counterattack against any British forces that broke through the defensive line. It was a calculated risk by the German commanders, using their remaining mobile reserves in an attempt to disrupt the British offensive momentum. The stage was being set for a meeting engagement that would test the courage and resourcefulness of soldiers on both sides. The British Crusader tank that Calistan served in represented both the promise and the limitations of British tank design in the early war years. Fast and maneuverable, with a top speed that could exceed 40 miles per hour on good terrain, the Crusader was intended to exploit breakthroughs and engage in the kind of mobile warfare that theorists had envisioned. In practice, it suffered from mechanical unreliability and thin armor that left it vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. Its main gun, while adequate against lighter German tanks, struggled against the heavier armor of newer German models. The Crusader's development had been rushed, reflecting Britain's desperate need for modern tanks as war approached. Engineers had prioritized speed and production numbers over comprehensive testing and refinement. The result was a tank that possessed excellent mobility but suffered from chronic mechanical problems. Cooling systems frequently failed in desert conditions. Transmissions broke down with alarming regularity. Track pins wore out quickly, leaving tanks immobilized until repairs could be effected. British tankers developed a complicated relationship with their vehicles. They appreciated the speed and generally good handling characteristics, but they were acutely aware that they were riding into battle in machines that offered less protection than their German counterparts. Crew survival rates in knocked-out Crusaders were lower than in some other tank types, a grim statistic that every tanker understood without needing official confirmation. Calistan's training had emphasized the importance of situational awareness and coordinated action. Tank warfare in the desert was fundamentally different from the close-quarters combat of European battlefields. Visibility extended for miles across the flat, open terrain. Dust clouds raised by moving vehicles could be seen from great distances, making surprise difficult to achieve. Engagements often began at ranges where both sides were barely visible to each other, with gunners searching for telltale flashes or the dark silhouettes of enemy armor against the horizon. The psychological dimension of tank combat was intense and peculiar. Sealed inside their steel boxes, crews experienced combat through a strange mixture of sensory deprivation and overwhelming stimulus. Vision was restricted to narrow periscope views. Sound was a confusing mixture of engine roar, track noise, radio communications, and the concussive impact of nearby explosions. The heat inside the tank was often unbearable, with temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Even before combat, added the heat of the main gun firing. The smell of hot metal, gun smoke, sweat, and sometimes fear was inescapable in the confined space. Effective tank crews developed an almost telepathic coordination, each member anticipating the other's actions and responding to commands with practiced efficiency. Calistan's crew had been together for 8 months, long enough to develop that crucial cohesion. Lieutenant Holbrook was a competent, if unimaginative, commander, the kind of officer who followed orders reliably and looked after his men. He had been commissioned from the ranks after demonstrating both tactical competence and leadership ability during training. His approach to command was methodical rather than inspired, but his crew trusted him to make sound decisions under pressure. Lance Corporal Davies, the driver, had worked in his father's garage before the war and possessed an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that had kept their tank running through multiple breakdowns. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone and had an uncanny ability to coax performance from machinery that should have failed completely. His value to the crew extended far beyond his technical skills. He maintained morale with his irreverent humor and his seemingly inexhaustible supply of improbable stories about his pre-war adventures. Private Wilson, the loader, was the youngest member of the crew at 19, but he had proven steady under fire and could maintain the impressive rate of fire that kept their gun in action during sustained engagements. He had lied about his age to enlist, driven by a combination of patriotic fervor and desire to escape a difficult family situation. The tank crew had become his surrogate family, and he worked tirelessly to prove himself worthy of their trust and acceptance. As the crew prepared for the October 27th advance, each man went through his personal rituals. Davies checked and rechecked the engine oil levels and transmission, his practiced hands moving over the machinery with the confidence of long familiarity. Wilson organized the ammunition racks, ensuring that different shell types were properly positioned for quick access during combat. He had developed a system that allowed him to grab the appropriate round by feel alone, crucial when smoke and chaos made visual identification difficult. Holbrook studied his maps and reviewed the radio frequencies they would use during the attack. He had learned through hard experience that communication failures killed soldiers as surely as enemy fire. He verified that their radio was functioning properly and that everyone understood the signals that would coordinate their advance with other tanks in the company. And Calistan, predictably, checked his rifle, working the bolt action smoothly and verifying that he had a full complement of 5-round stripper clips in his personal gear. He cleaned the weapon carefully, removing any sand or dust that might interfere with its operation. The ritual was comforting, a connection to his father's teachings and a tangible reminder that he retained some measure of control over his fate. "Still planning to infantry yourself out of trouble, Charlie?" Davies called from his driver's position, his voice carrying the forced levity that soldiers use to mask pre-battle anxiety. "Just being prepared, mate," Calistan replied, his Birmingham accent softened by years in the army but still noticeable. "My old man always said the bloke with 2 plans usually beats the bloke with 1. The advance began at dawn, with the company of Crusaders moving forward in a dispersed formation designed to minimize the damage from any single enemy gun. The morning sun was rising behind them, silhouetting the British tanks against the sky, a tactical disadvantage that commanders had weighed against the benefit of having the low sun potentially blinding German gunners. Artillery had pounded the German positions for 30 minutes before the advance, raising enormous clouds of dust and smoke that obscured the battlefield. The preliminary bombardment was intended to suppress German defenders and destroy anti-tank guns before the British armor arrived. In practice, artillery was less effective against dug-in positions than planners hoped. German crews had learned to take cover during bombardments and return to their guns quickly once the shelling stopped. The real value of the artillery was psychological. The sustained barrage wore down enemy nerves and created confusion that could be exploited during the assault. Calistan scanned his designated sector through the gunner's periscope, searching for targets. The German defensive position materialized through the dust, a series of dug-in positions marked by the angular shapes of anti-tank guns and the darker spots that might indicate infantry positions. Radio traffic crackled with reports from other tanks, citing information, and the terse combat communications that marked the beginning of engagement. The first German gun opened fire at approximately 1,200 yards. A flash of light followed seconds later by the screaming passage of the shell and its impact in the sand beyond the British line. Within moments, multiple German guns were firing, creating a steel gauntlet that the British tanks had to pass through. The Crusaders returned fire, their 2-pounder guns spitting shells toward the German positions. The battlefield erupted into the organized chaos that defined mechanized combat. Calistan's tank shuddered as rounds passed close by, the near misses creating a percussion that could be felt through the entire vehicle. He acquired a target, a German anti-tank gun partially concealed in a scraped-out pit, and fired. The gun recoiled, shell casing ejecting with a metallic clang, and Wilson was already loading the next round before Calistan could confirm the hit. Through the dust and smoke, he thought he saw the German gun crew abandoning their position, but there was no time to celebrate. Another gun had opened fire from a different angle. The British tanks pressed forward, taking casualties but maintaining momentum. 2 Crusaders on the left flank brewed up almost simultaneously, hit by the same well-positioned German gun. The remaining tanks shifted their advance, attempting to suppress the deadly weapon. The German defensive line was crumbling under the sustained pressure, but it was extracting a terrible price for every yard of ground. Inside Calistan's tank, the crew functioned with the efficiency of long practice. Holbrook called out targets and adjusted their course. Davies maneuvered the tank to present the smallest profile to enemy guns while maintaining their advance. Wilson maintained a steady supply of ammunition, selecting the appropriate shell type based on the targets Calistan was engaging. And Calistan himself worked the gun with methodical precision, identifying targets, calculating range and lead, firing, and immediately searching for the next threat. Calistan's crew had just crested the ridge, moving past the now silent German gun positions, when the mechanical failure occurred. Without warning, the Crusader's engine made a grinding, tortured sound and seized completely. The tank rolled to a stop, momentum carrying it a few yards down the reverse slope of the ridge before Davies could fully brake. "Engine's dead," Davies shouted, his voice tight with the panic that every tanker felt when their vehicle became immobile. A stationary tank on a battlefield was not a defensive position. It was a target and a tomb. Holbrook's training took over. "All crew, prepare to abandon vehicle. Davies, can you restart?" The driver was already attempting it, working the starter motor while making adjustments that might coax life back into the engine. Nothing. The mechanical failure was complete and catastrophic. Davies's face reflected his frustration and fear. His mechanical skills, so valuable in other situations, could not resurrect an engine that had suffered terminal damage. It was at that moment, as the crew prepared to bail out and run for whatever cover they could find, that Calistan spotted the German counterattack developing. Through the commander's periscope, Holbrook had popped the hatch to get a better view of their situation. Calistan saw movement along the desert floor about 800 yards to their front. Dust clouds first, then the distinctive silhouettes of German tanks and half-tracks. A counterattack force, probably company strength, moving rapidly toward the British positions. The timing was perfect from the German perspective and catastrophic from the British. The British tanks had just pushed through the defensive line and were scattered, many dealing with mechanical issues or battle damage. The supporting infantry was still making its way forward. For a few critical minutes, there would be a gap in the British line, and the disabled Crusader sat almost exactly where that gap existed. The situation Calistan found himself in represented the fundamental unpredictability of warfare that no amount of training or planning could fully address. Military theory emphasized firepower, maneuver, and combined arms coordination. Doctrine provided frameworks for how units should advance, how to respond to enemy contact, how to exploit success, or defend against counterattack. But doctrine could not account for the random mechanical failure that left a single tank crew stranded in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. The decision point that every soldier dreads had arrived. The obvious rational course of action was to abandon the useless tank immediately and retreat to British lines. A disabled tank had no combat value. The crew's lives were worth more than the vehicle. Military protocol was clear. When your tank became immobile in an exposed position, You evacuated and preserved the crew for future combat. To stay was to die for no purpose. But Calistan saw something his crewmates initially did not. The German counterattack was not aimed randomly. It was targeting the precise sector where their disabled tank sat. If the German force broke through here, it would roll up the British flank and potentially turn the entire day's advance into a costly failure. Other British units were already engaged to the left and right, committed to their own fights. The gap existed because of the casualties taken during the advance and the time lag before reserves could move forward. "We need to go now!" Holbrook was shouting. Already halfway out of the commander's hatch, he had spotted the approaching Germans and reached the same tactical assessment that Calistan had, but arrived at the opposite conclusion. "Sir, we're the only thing between them and our lads," Calistan said, his voice carrying a strange calm that cut through the urgency of the moment. "If we run, they break through clean." "We're one disabled tank," Holbrook shot back. "We can't stop a company." It was in this moment that Calistan made a decision that defied military logic, personal survival instinct, and the direct implications of his commanding officer's order. He grabbed his Lee-Enfield rifle, the weapon that had been the subject of so much gentle mockery, and yanked open the gunner's hatch. "Then I'll slow them down," he said, and before Holbrook could physically stop him, Calistan had pulled himself out of the tank and dropped to the ground on the reverse slope of the ridge, using the disabled Crusader as cover. The concept of individual action altering the course of larger battles was not new to military history. Horatius at the bridge, holding off an army while Rome destroyed the crossing behind him. Sergeant York, whose rifle skills neutralized an entire German machine gun nest in World War I. Audie Murphy, standing on a burning tank destroyer while fighting off a German infantry assault. These stories persisted in military culture, not because they were common, they were extraordinarily rare, but because they represented something fundamental about human courage and the individual's capacity to influence events that seemed far beyond personal control. What Calistan attempted in the desert that day was a variation on this ancient theme, adapted to the realities of mechanized warfare. He understood that he could not destroy the approaching German force. A single rifleman, no matter how skilled, could not defeat tanks and armored vehicles. But warfare was not simply about destruction, it was about time, tempo, and decision-making. If he could disrupt the German advance, even briefly, it might buy enough time for British forces to respond. If he could force the German commanders to slow down, to deploy infantry to deal with the unexpected resistance, the entire timetable of their counterattack would be thrown off. The psychological dimension of his plan was equally important. A counterattack succeeded through momentum and confidence. The German crews advancing rapidly across open ground, expected to overwhelm scattered British resistance. An unexpected obstacle, even a seemingly minor one, could introduce hesitation and caution into their decision-making. In mechanized warfare, where visibility was often limited and commanders made decisions based on fragmentary information, creating uncertainty in an enemy's mind could be as valuable as destroying his equipment. Calistan understood something fundamental about human psychology under combat conditions. Soldiers and commanders made decisions based on incomplete information and assumptions shaped by training and experience. The German commanders would assume that resistance indicated a defensive position of some substance. Their doctrine and training emphasized the dangers of advancing blindly into prepared positions. If he could create the appearance of organized resistance, even briefly, it might trigger responses disproportionate to the actual threat he posed. But the plan required Calistan to do something that went against every survival instinct he possessed. Remain in an exposed position, alone, and engage enemy forces that massively outgunned him. The life expectancy of what he was proposing could be measured in minutes, perhaps seconds, once the Germans identified his position and brought their overwhelming firepower to bear. Inside the tank, the remaining crew members were processing what had just happened. Wilson, the young loader, looked at Holbrook with confusion and dawning horror. "Sir, is he really going to—" "Everyone out now," Holbrook commanded, though his voice had lost its certainty. The officer was caught between his duty to preserve his crew and a growing realization that Calistan might have identified something important that they were all missing. "Move to British lines and report our position. Tell them there's a German counterattack developing here." Davies, the driver, was staring at Calistan's figure through the vision port. "We can't just leave him." "We're not equipped to fight infantry on foot," Holbrook said, pulling his service revolver from its holster. a weapon nearly as useless against tanks as Calistan's rifle. "We need to get help, that's how we support him now." The decision Holbrook made in that moment reflected his own evolution as a leader. His instinct was to order everyone to safety, to preserve his crew according to doctrine. But he recognized that Calistan had identified a tactical reality that changed the calculation. If they could get reinforcements to this position quickly enough, Calistan's improvised stand might actually accomplish something meaningful. Holbrook's job was to make that possible. As the three men scrambled out of the tank and began running toward British positions, Calistan was already setting up his personal defensive position. The disabled Crusader provided cover from direct fire, its bulk creating a dead zone that the German forces would have difficulty engaging without approaching much closer. The slight reverse slope where the tank had stopped offered additional protection, allowing Calistan to expose himself minimally while still maintaining sightlines toward the approaching German force. He had perhaps 40 rounds of .303 ammunition in stripper clips, enough for rapid fire but hardly an arsenal. The Lee-Enfield rifle was a weapon that British soldiers had carried into battle for more than 40 years, reliable and accurate, capable of sustained rates of fire in skilled hands. Calistan was very skilled. During training, he had consistently outshot his peers in rifle qualification, a talent that seemed quaint and outdated in an era of mechanized warfare, but which now represented his only means of influencing the battle. The Lee-Enfield was a weapon steeped in British military history. It had armed soldiers through 2 world wars, serving from the trenches of the Western Front to the jungles of Burma. Its 10-round magazine gave it superior capacity compared to many contemporary rifles. The smooth bolt action allowed skilled riflemen to achieve rates of fire that approached semi-automatic weapons. British soldiers called it the rifle that saved an empire, and while that was hyperbolic, the weapon had proven its worth across decades of service. The German force was closing rapidly, now less than 600 yards away. Calistan could distinguish individual vehicle types. Panzer III tanks in the lead, their 50mm guns more than adequate to deal with British armor. Behind them, SDKFZ 251 half-tracks carrying infantry, a Panzer IV bringing up the rear, its 75mm gun capable of devastating any Allied tank it encountered. The formation suggested a confident, aggressive approach. These crews expected to smash through whatever resistance they encountered. Calistan took a deep breath, feeling the desert heat, tasting the dust that hung perpetually in the air. This moment represented the convergence of everything his father had tried to teach him about soldiering. Not the parade ground drilling or the manual of arms, but the fundamental truth that war came down to individual choices made under terrible pressure when there was no perfect option and every decision carried potentially fatal consequences. The weight of the rifle in his hands was familiar and comforting. He had cleaned this weapon hundreds of times, fired thousands of rounds through it during training. Every scratch on the wooden stock, every minor imperfection in the metal was as familiar to him as the lines on his own hands. The rifle had been an object of ridicule among his crewmates, a quirky affectation that marked him as slightly eccentric. Now it was the only tool available to accomplish an impossible task. Calistan thought briefly of his family back in Birmingham, his mother, who had cried when he enlisted but understood why he felt compelled to serve. His father, whose stories of the Great War had shaped Calistan's understanding of what soldiering truly meant. His younger sister, who wrote him letters filled with gossip about neighbors and friends, maintaining a connection to normal life that felt increasingly distant with each month in the desert. Would they understand what he was about to attempt? Would they see it as heroism or foolishness? The questions faded as training and instinct took over. There was no more time for reflection or doubt. The German force was within effective range, and every second of hesitation was a second wasted. Calistan settled into position, his body automatically assuming the stable firing platform that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training. The rifle came up to his shoulder, the sights aligned on his first target. His breathing slowed, his finger found the trigger, and the long afternoon of impossible odds began. The approaching Germans had no idea they were about to encounter resistance. From their perspective, they were exploiting a successful breakthrough, moving through a gap in British lines before reserves could seal it. The disabled Crusader tank they could see ahead was just another casualty of the morning's fighting, abandoned like dozens of other vehicles scattered across the battlefield. There was no reason to expect that a single British soldier was preparing to challenge their advance. Calistan settled into a firing position, using the tank's track as a rest for his rifle barrel. At 500 yards, he selected his first target, not a tank, which would be impervious to rifle fire, but a commander. He could see the figure standing in the cupola of the lead Panzer III, binoculars raised as he scanned the battlefield ahead. Tank commanders often expose themselves during advances to maintain better situational awareness, a calculated risk that was generally justified by the improved ability to command their vehicles. The Lee-Enfield's trigger pull was familiar and comfortable. Calistan compensated slightly for range and the gentle crosswind that blew eternally across the desert. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and 500 yards away the German tank commander jerked backward and disappeared into his turret. One shot, one hit. And suddenly, the entire dynamic of the German advance shifted. The lead Panzer III slowed uncertainly, its commander either wounded or dead, the crew suddenly lacking the leadership that coordinated their actions. The tanks behind it adjusted their speed to match, maintaining formation discipline even as confusion rippled through their ranks. Who had fired? Where had the shot come from? Was there an entire British infantry position that their reconnaissance had missed? Calistan worked the rifle's bolt, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a fresh round. He shifted his aim to the next visible target, another tank commander in the 2nd Panzer III. The range was increasing slightly as the German formation's momentum had carried them forward, but not enough to matter. He fired again and again saw his target react to the hit. The German tanks began to spread out, their commanders sensing danger but unable to precisely locate its source. The half-tracks carrying infantry had stopped entirely, their crews unwilling to advance into what might be a prepared defensive position without better information. This was exactly the reaction Calistan needed to provoke. Each second of hesitation was a second bought for British forces to respond. German tank doctrine emphasized aggressive action and rapid decision-making, but it also stressed the importance of infantry-tank coordination when faced with anti-tank defenses. The commanders of this counterattack force faced a decision point. They could push forward aggressively, accepting casualties from whatever British position was engaging them, or they could deploy their infantry to clear the position before continuing the advance. The first option was faster, but potentially more costly. The second was more cautious, but would consume valuable time. A German officer, probably the company commander, made the decision to deploy infantry. Calistan watched as troops began dismounting from the half-tracks, forming up in skirmish lines to advance and locate the source of the rifle fire. It was a tactically sound decision that played directly into Calistan's hands. Infantry advancing across open ground would take time, and every minute they spent in this engagement was another minute for British forces to organize a response. But the German infantry advance also represented an escalating threat to Calistan personally. Once they identified his position at the disabled tank, they could coordinate with their armor to suppress him with overwhelming firepower. Tank main guns and machine guns, combined with infantry, small arms, and potentially mortars, would make his position untenable within minutes of being located. Calistan shifted his focus to the deploying infantry, engaging targets at ranges where his marksmanship training gave him a significant advantage. The Lee-Enfield could deliver accurate fire out to 600 yards in skilled hands, and Calistan's hands were very skilled. He worked methodically, selecting targets, firing, working the bolt, firing again. He was not attempting to single-handedly defeat the German infantry. That would be impossible. Instead, he was creating casualties that forced the German soldiers to take cover, slowing their advance to a cautious crawl as they tried to identify where the fire was coming from. The German soldiers were professionals, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. They reacted to contact with practiced efficiency, dropping to prone positions and returning fire toward the general direction of Calistan's position. Their training emphasized fire and maneuver, one element providing covering fire while another advanced, but without clear identification of their target, the maneuver element hesitated, unwilling to advance into killing ground without better information. The German tanks, meanwhile, had begun firing at the disabled Crusader, their main guns and machine guns hammering at the vehicle that they correctly assumed was providing cover for whoever was shooting at them. High explosive shells struck the already dead tank, tearing chunks of metal from its hull. Machine gun rounds sparked off the armor, creating a storm of steel that made Calistan's position increasingly dangerous. He shifted position slightly, using different parts of the tank's bulk for cover as the German fire concentrated on areas he had just left. Shrapnel from exploding shells peppered the ground around him. The noise was deafening, a continuous roar of detonating shells and hammering machine guns that made coordinated thought nearly impossible. This was the environment where soldiers broke, where the human nervous system simply overloaded from the sensory input, and the conscious mind retreated into shock or panic. Calistan kept firing. He had expended perhaps 15 rounds, leaving him with less than 30. The German infantry advance had stalled approximately 200 yards from his position, the soldiers taking cover in whatever scrapes and depressions the desert floor offered. They were engaging him with rifle and machine gun fire, but at this range and with Calistan using the tank as substantial cover, their fire was more suppressive than accurately deadly. The situation had reached a temporary stalemate that could not last. The Germans had superior numbers and firepower. Once they coordinated properly or brought up additional resources, they would overwhelm his position. But the stalemate was consuming time, precious minutes during which the German counterattack was stalled and British forces had opportunity to respond. The psychological toll of maintaining his position under such intense fire was immense. Every instinct screamed at Calistan to run, to seek better cover, to escape the killing zone he had deliberately placed himself in. His hands shook between shots, his mouth was dry and his heart hammered with the adrenaline surge that accompanied mortal danger. But he forced himself to continue, to maintain the disciplined fire that created the illusion of organized resistance. Help arrived in the form of Lieutenant Holbrook and a platoon of British infantry who had been hustled forward after Holbrook reported the situation. They approached from the reverse slope, using the same terrain that protected Calistan's position to advance unseen by the Germans. Holbrook had done exactly what a good officer should. He had identified a critical situation, reported it through proper channels, and then personally led the response force back to the point of crisis. The infantry platoon, approximately 30 men, took up positions around the disabled Crusader, reinforcing Calistan's lone stand with proper defensive depth. Their sudden appearance and volume of fire shocked the German infantry, who had been focused on eliminating what they believed was a single stubborn holdout. The tactical situation reversed in moments. The Germans, caught in the open and now facing an established defensive position, began taking casualties. The British infantry sergeant who commanded the platoon was a veteran named Henderson, a professional soldier who had served in India before the war. He quickly assessed the situation and began organizing his men for maximum effect. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Riflemen occupied positions that gave them clear sight lines toward the German force. Within minutes, what had been Calistan's desperate individual stand became a properly organized defensive position. The German tank commanders, observing the sudden increase in British fire, faced their own decision point. They could commit to a costly assault against what now appeared to be a reinforced position, or they could break off the counterattack and withdraw. The element of surprise was gone. The momentum had been lost, and British tank reinforcements were almost certainly approaching. They chose withdrawal. The panzers began backing up, their turrets traversing to cover their infantry's retreat. The German soldiers scrambled back toward their half-tracks, leaving several bodies motionless in the sand. Within minutes, the entire German force was pulling back, the counterattack broken before it had achieved any of its objectives. Calistan lowered his rifle, his hands trembling slightly with the after-effects of adrenaline. His ears rang from the sustained gunfire. He had perhaps 20 rounds of ammunition remaining. The Crusader tank behind him was even more destroyed than before, its hull perforated with holes from German shells and machine gun fire. By any rational assessment, he should have been dead. The fact that he was alive felt almost accidental, a lottery he had won against improbable odds. Lieutenant Holbrook approached, his expression complex, relief, anger, and something that might have been respect competing for dominance. "Sergeant Calistan, that was the most magnificent display of insubordination I have ever witnessed." "Yes, sir," Calistan replied, because there was nothing else to say. He had disobeyed a direct order. That he had potentially saved dozens of lives and prevented a dangerous breakthrough was not an excuse in military law. "I'm putting you in for a medal," Holbrook continued, "and also for a reprimand. We'll see which one the brass decides matters more." The British infantry sergeant who had led the reinforcements walked over, looking at Calistan with undisguised admiration. "My lads are saying you held off a company with just a rifle. That true?" "I slowed them down," Calistan said quietly. They did the rest when you lot arrived. Bollocks to that, Henderson said with a grin. You gave them a proper kicking before we showed up. My name's Henderson, by the way. Remind me never to get on your bad side. The aftermath of the engagement at that desolate stretch of desert raised questions that would occupy military analysts and historians for decades. Had Calistan's action been justified? Was it brilliant improvisation or reckless disobedience? Could his lone stand be held up as an example of proper military conduct, or was it a dangerous aberration that succeeded despite violating fundamental principles of tactics and discipline? The immediate military response was decidedly mixed. Calistan received the Distinguished Conduct Medal, Britain's second highest award for gallantry by enlisted personnel, recognizing his extraordinary courage under fire. The citation praised his initiative, determination, and complete disregard for personal safety in disrupting an enemy counterattack. But he also received a formal reprimand for disobeying Lieutenant Holbrook's order to evacuate the disabled tank, a black mark on his service record that would follow him through the rest of his military career. This dichotomy reflected a fundamental tension in military culture between discipline and initiative. Armies function through hierarchical command structures and standardized procedures. Soldiers are trained to follow orders, to execute plans developed by commanders with broader perspectives and better information. The entire system depends on predictable responses to commands, allowing complex operations involving thousands of individuals to be coordinated effectively. When soldiers begin making independent decisions that contradict orders, even for good reasons, the system's coherence begins to break down. Yet warfare is fundamentally unpredictable. Plans fail, communications break down, and battlefield conditions change faster than commanders can adjust their orders. The German military had a concept called Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, which emphasized giving subordinates clear objectives while allowing them flexibility in execution. This approach recognized that the soldier on the ground often had better immediate understanding of tactical realities than commanders positioned farther to the rear. British and American armies tended toward more centralized command structures, though individual commanders varied widely in how much initiative they encouraged. Calistan's action existed in the murky territory between insubordination and inspired improvisation. He had correctly assessed that the standard procedure, evacuate the disabled tank, would result in a gap in British lines that the German counterattack could exploit. He had recognized that even minimal resistance at that critical point might disrupt enemy timing enough to allow British forces to respond. His assessment proved accurate, and his execution was effective. But what if he had been wrong? What if the German force had been larger than he estimated, or more aggressive, or supported by artillery that could have quickly destroyed his position? What if his solitary stand had simply resulted in his death without meaningfully affecting the German advance? Would his action then be remembered as pointless sacrifice born of poor judgment? The line between heroism and foolhardiness is often determined retrospectively by whether the action succeeded. Critics of Calistan's approach argued that he had violated the fundamental principle that equipment can be replaced, but trained soldiers cannot. His crew, had they stayed with him, would have been equally exposed to the German counterattack with no greater ability to influence it. By evacuating, they preserved 4 trained tankers who could be assigned to another vehicle and return to combat. Calistan's decision to stay was, by this logic, privileging abstract concepts like position holding over the practical reality of personnel preservation. Military philosophers might compare Calistan's action to similar historical incidents. The charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava in 1854 was often cited as an example of courage that accomplished nothing meaningful because the tactical objective was flawed. The defense of Rorke's Drift in 1879 saw a small British force hold off a massive Zulu army, but that was a prepared defensive position with substantial fortifications, not an improvised stand by a lone rifleman. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held a pass against a Persian army, had been immortalized in Western military culture, but it was also a specifically designed delaying action with clear strategic purpose. What made Calistan's situation unique was its individual spontaneity. He had not been ordered to hold the position. There was no coordinated plan that his action supported. He simply made a judgment call in the moment, based on his assessment of tactical realities and his personal willingness to accept enormous risk. This kind of independent action was simultaneously The strength and the danger of professional military forces. The strength because it allowed adaptation to unexpected circumstances. The danger because it could lead to chaos if everyone began making independent tactical decisions. The German perspective on the engagement added another layer of complexity. German after-action reports noted the encounter with an unexpected British defensive position, but did not elaborate on the actual composition of that position. To the German commanders, they had encountered resistance at an inopportune moment and made the prudent decision to withdraw rather than accept casualties for a counterattack that had lost its element of surprise. They had no idea that the defensive position that stalled their advance initially consisted of one man with a rifle. This highlighted an important truth about warfare. Perception often mattered as much as reality. The German force was fully capable of destroying Calistan's position had they realized what they were facing. But their uncertainty, their assumption that they were encountering a more substantial force, led to decisions that gave that position more combat power than it physically possessed. Deception and psychological effect had been multipliers of Calistan's limited material resources. Some military analysts argued that the real lesson of the incident was not about individual heroism, but about the importance of combined arms coordination. If British tank forces had maintained better contact with their supporting infantry, the gap that Calistan's disabled tank fell into would not have existed. If British reconnaissance had been more thorough, the German counterattack might have been detected earlier and met with prepared defenses. The fact that a lone rifleman had been necessary to prevent a breakthrough suggested systemic failures in British tactical procedures. Others contended that this view missed the point entirely. War was inherently chaotic, and no amount of planning or coordination could eliminate the friction and uncertainty that Clausewitz had identified as fundamental to combat. The real lesson was about adaptability and the individual soldier's capacity to recognize and respond to critical moments. Calistan's value was not in his rifle skills, impressive though they were, but in his ability to read the tactical situation, make a rapid assessment, and commit to a course of action when hesitation would have been fatal. The question of leadership was equally complex. Lieutenant Holbrook had ordered his crew to evacuate, a decision that was tactically sound and consistent with proper procedure. He had then taken the initiative to report the situation and lead reinforcements back to the position, demonstrating exactly the kind of responsible leadership that the military sought to cultivate. Yet his order had been disobeyed by a subordinate who turned out to be correct about the tactical necessity of holding the position. How should commanders balance the need for discipline with the recognition that subordinates sometimes have valid insights that contradict orders? The incident became a case study in several military academies, used to spark discussion about initiative, discipline, and decision-making under pressure. Instructors found that student officers usually divided into roughly 3 camps. One group argued that Calistan had behaved properly, and that Holbrook should have recognized the tactical importance of the position before ordering evacuation. Another group insisted that Calistan's disobedience, however successful, set a dangerous precedent that could not be endorsed. A third group suggested that both men had acted appropriately given their different perspectives and responsibilities, and that the successful outcome justified both the initial order and its violation. In the broader context of military history, Calistan's action represented a particular type of battlefield moment that transcended the specific details of technology and tactics. Throughout history, there had been soldiers who recognized critical junctures where individual action could influence outcomes disproportionate to the resources employed. These moments required not just courage but judgment, the ability to distinguish between pointless sacrifice and meaningful intervention, between stubbornness and strategic necessity. The moral dimension of Calistan's choice also invited reflection. He had deliberately placed himself in mortal danger to accomplish an objective that was ultimately about protecting others. The British soldiers who would have been exposed to the German counterattack were strangers to him, fellow countrymen but not personal friends or family. His obligation to them was abstract, defined by military duty and shared national identity rather than personal relationships. Yet he had been willing to die for that abstract obligation, suggesting a conception of duty that transcended self-interest. Philosophers might debate whether Calistan's action represented a form of utilitarian calculation, one life risked to save potentially many others, or whether it reflected a deontological commitment to duty regardless of consequences. The reality was probably more complex than either interpretation suggested. Calistan had not conducted a careful cost-benefit analysis before acting. He had seen a problem, recognized a solution, and committed to executing that solution before fully thinking through all the implications. This kind of rapid decision-making under extreme pressure was characteristic of effective soldiers throughout history. The ability to function when there was no time for careful deliberation, when action had to be taken based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes, separated soldiers who influenced battles from those who merely participated in them. Training could develop these capabilities to some extent, but there remained an irreducible element of individual judgment and character that determined how soldiers performed in critical moments. Charles Calistan survived the Second World War, serving through the remainder of the North African campaign and then in the Italian theater. He was never given another tank. Instead, he was transferred to infantry, where his rifle skills and tactical judgment made him a valuable asset. He participated in the difficult fighting around Monte Cassino, where once again he demonstrated the kind of courage under fire that marked the best soldiers of his generation. He ended the war as a company sergeant major, a rank that reflected both his combat effectiveness and his leadership abilities. After the war, Calistan returned to Birmingham and worked for 30 years as a machinist in a factory that manufactured automotive parts. He married, raised 3 children, and lived the quiet, unremarkable life that most veterans sought after years of combat. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. When his children asked about the medals displayed in a small frame in his study, he would offer brief, factual explanations devoid of drama or self-aggrandizement. "I did my bit, same as millions of others," was his standard response to questions about his service. His wife, Dorothy, whom he had met at a church social in 1946, understood that there were parts of his past he needed to keep private. She never pressed him for details about the war, sensing that those memories carried weights that were best left undisturbed. Their marriage was characterized by quiet companionship, mutual respect, and shared commitment to building a stable life for their children. Dorothy worked as a school secretary, and together they created the kind of comfortable middle-class existence that represented success for their generation. The Lee-Enfield rifle that he had carried into battle was turned in to military authorities at war's end, as regulations required. He never owned a firearm as a civilian, never hunted, never had any interest in recreational shooting. The weapon had been a tool for a specific purpose during a specific period of his life, and when that period ended, so did his relationship with it. But the principle that the rifle had represented, the importance of preparation, adaptability, and the willingness to use whatever resources were available when circumstances demanded it, remained central to how he lived his life. Lieutenant James Holbrook also survived the war and remained in the military, eventually retiring as a colonel. In his later years, he gave several interviews about his experiences in North Africa, and he always made a point of discussing Calistan's stand at El Alamein. "I ordered him to evacuate and he disobeyed me," Holbrook would explain. "It was technically insubordination. It was also one of the finest pieces of soldiering I ever witnessed. The mark of a good officer is recognizing when a subordinate understands something you don't, and having the grace to support them rather than punishing them for being right when you were wrong." Holbrook and Calistan maintained correspondence after the war, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional letters that gradually became more candid about their wartime experiences as the years passed and the immediacy of those events faded. In one letter from 1967, Holbrook wrote, "I've spent my entire career trying to train officers to make good tactical decisions. What you taught me that day is that sometimes the best tactical decision is recognizing that your subordinate has made a better one than you did, and getting out of his way." The disabled Crusader tank remained in the desert for several weeks after the battle, too damaged to be recovered and repaired. British salvage crews eventually stripped it of any useful components, and the hulk was left to slowly rust in the harsh desert environment. For a few years after the war, veterans would occasionally visit the battlefield, and some sought out the wreckage of Calistan's tank, wanting to see the place where one man with a rifle had achieved something remarkable. Eventually, the tank disappeared, buried by shifting sands or removed by scrap metal collectors, its physical presence erased, but its story preserved. The Battle of El Alamein entered history as the turning point of the North African campaign, the moment when Allied forces began the long push that would eventually drive Axis forces from the continent. Montgomery's victory there, combined with the nearly simultaneous American landings in Operation Torch, marked the beginning of the end for Rommel's Afrika Korps. Churchill famously said, "Before Alamein we never had a victory. After Alamein we never had a defeat." The grand strategic importance of the battle was undeniable. Within that larger narrative, individual actions like Calistan's became footnotes, small stories overwhelmed by the scale of armies, divisions, and army groups. Yet these individual moments were the building blocks of victory. Every successful battle was composed of thousands of individual decisions, some made by commanding generals, and some made by sergeants who found themselves in the right place at the right time with the judgment and courage to act decisively. The mockery that Calistan had endured for carrying his rifle into tank combat ended after El Alamein. His surviving crewmates told the story to anyone who would listen, and it spread through the regiment with the speed that memorable stories always achieve in military units. Other tankers began carrying personal weapons, recognizing that the boundaries between different types of warfare were more fluid than doctrinal manuals suggested. The lesson was not that every tanker should become an infantryman, but that adaptability and preparation for unexpected circumstances could make the difference between mission success and failure. Modern military forces, with their emphasis on joint operations and the integration of different combat arms, might view Calistan's story as validation of cross-training and flexibility. Special operations forces routinely train in capabilities far beyond their primary specialties, recognizing that complex missions may require skills from multiple domains. The rigid separation between tankers, infantry, artillery, and other specialties that characterized Second World War armies has given way to more fluid organizational structures, where soldiers are expected to be competent in multiple roles. But technology has not eliminated the fundamental human elements that Calistan's story exemplifies. Modern soldiers still face moments when equipment fails, plans go wrong, and survival depends on individual initiative and courage. A drone operator whose technology fails may need to call for fire using basic radio procedures. An infantryman may need to take over operation of a vehicle when the driver is incapacitated. A combat medic may need to provide tactical guidance when all the infantry leaders in a unit become casualties. The specifics change with each generation of warfare, but the underlying principle remains constant. Wars are fought by humans who must adapt to circumstances that exceed the boundaries of their training and planning. Calistan's action also speaks to the persistent importance of will in warfare. All the technology, firepower, and numerical superiority in the world cannot substitute for the human decision to stand and fight when circumstances offer every rational justification for retreat. Military planners can calculate force ratios, predict casualty rates, and model combat outcomes with sophisticated computer simulations. But they cannot reliably predict which soldiers will possess the particular combination of courage, judgment, and determination that allows them to influence battles in ways that defy conventional military mathematics. The question of whether Calistan's action should be emulated or discouraged remains unresolved. Military establishments need discipline and adherence to proper procedures. They cannot function if every soldier begins making independent tactical decisions based on personal assessments that may contradict orders. Yet they also need soldiers capable of initiative, of recognizing when circumstances demand deviation from standard procedures. Finding the balance between these competing requirements is one of the enduring challenges of military leadership. Perhaps the most appropriate conclusion is that Calistan's story should not be interpreted as a simple prescription for how soldiers should behave. It is, instead, a reminder that warfare reduces situations to fundamental questions about human character. When stripped of the structures and supports that normally govern behavior, when facing immediate danger and making decisions that will determine life and death, what do individuals choose to do? Some choose survival at any cost. Some choose to follow orders regardless of their personal assessment, and some, like Calistan, choose to act based on their judgment of what the situation requires, accepting whatever consequences that choice brings. The legacy of that October afternoon in 1942 extends beyond military history into the broader human story of courage under extreme circumstances. Every society produces individuals who, when tested, demonstrate capacities that surprise even themselves. They are not superhuman. Calistan was frightened throughout the engagement, His hands shook with adrenaline, and he later admitted that had he fully understood the odds against him, he might have made a different choice. But in the moment, he acted according to principles that valued mission accomplishment and protecting his comrades over his personal survival. The soldiers who fought at El Alamein and across the battlefields of the Second World War were not fundamentally different from civilians. They experienced fear, doubt, and the desire for safety. What distinguished them was their willingness to act despite those feelings, to function effectively when every instinct screamed for self-preservation. Calistan's stand was exceptional in its drama and impact, but it was representative of countless smaller acts of courage that collectively determined the war's outcome. In the workshops and pubs of post-war Birmingham, Calistan was known simply as Charlie, a skilled machinist who could fix almost anything mechanical, a devoted father who attended every school event his children participated in, a reliable friend who could be counted on in difficult times. The hero of El Alamein had become invisible in plain sight, camouflaged by the normalcy of civilian life. His neighbors and co-workers knew he had served in the war, as most men of his generation had, but few knew the specifics of what he had done. On the rare occasions when someone would learn about his Distinguished Conduct Medal and ask him to tell the story, Calistan's response was consistent. "It was one afternoon in a very long war," he would say. "Thousands of men did things just as brave or braver. I happened to be in a spot where what I could do mattered and I did it. That's all there is to it, really." This modesty was characteristic of his generation of veterans, men who had endured extraordinary circumstances but returned to build ordinary lives. They saw their wartime service as a duty fulfilled, not an achievement to be constantly celebrated. The war had been a disruption to normal life, a necessary response to an existential threat, but not the defining feature of their identity. They had fought so that life could return to normal, and having achieved that goal, they embraced the normalcy they had won. Charles Calistan died in 1994 at the age of 76, surrounded by family who knew him primarily as a grandfather who told terrible jokes and grew excellent tomatoes in his back garden. The hero of El Alamein had become what most veterans become, a civilian whose wartime service was a chapter in a longer, more complex life story. But the principles he exemplified in that brief, violent engagement in the desert remain relevant to any discussion of courage, duty, and the capacity of individuals to affect the course of history through decisive action in critical moments. His funeral was attended by several former soldiers who had served with him, including Lieutenant Colonel Holbrook, retired, who delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of Calistan's character. "Charlie never thought of himself as a hero," Holbrook said. "He would have been embarrassed by that word. He was a soldier who did his job, and he did it extraordinarily well when circumstances demanded it. That's the only kind of hero that matters. The kind who shows up, does what needs doing, and then goes home to live a good life." They laughed at the tank gunner's rifle until he used it to halt a German advance at El Alamein, and in doing so, he reminded everyone who heard his story afterward that in warfare, as in life, it is not the tools you carry, but the will to use them effectively that ultimately determines success or failure. The rifle was never useless. It simply awaited the moment when its utility would be undeniable, and a soldier brave enough to stake his life on using it when that moment arrived. The desert sun that beat down on Calistan during those desperate minutes in October 1942 shone with the same indifferent intensity whether men lived or died beneath it. The sand that provided scant cover from German fire would eventually cover the tank, the shell casings, and all physical evidence of what had occurred there. Nature would reclaim the battlefield, erasing the scars of combat with patient, inexorable persistence. But the human memory of what one man accomplished with a rifle, courage, and the judgment to recognize when personal sacrifice might serve a larger purpose, that memory would persist, passed down through generations as a testament to what individuals can achieve when they refuse to accept the limitations that circumstances seem to impose. In the end, perhaps that is the real legacy of Sergeant Charles Calistan's stand at El Alamein, not the tactical details of how one rifleman stalled a tank company, but the enduring reminder that human will, properly directed and courageously applied, remains the decisive factor in warfare regardless of technological change. Armies equipped with the most advanced weapons still depend on individuals willing to use those weapons, or in Calistan's case, willing to use whatever they have when advanced weapons fail. The tools of war evolve with each generation, but the human qualities that determine their effective employment, courage, judgment, adaptability, and the willingness to act decisively under pressure remained constant across the centuries. The story of Charles Calistan and his rifle ultimately transcends its specific historical context to become a parable about human potential in the face of overwhelming odds. It reminds us that individuals matter, that single acts of courage can influence events far beyond their immediate scope, and that the judgment to recognize critical moments and the will to act decisively in those moments are qualities that every generation must cultivate anew. In an age of increasingly complex and technologically sophisticated warfare, the lessons from that October afternoon in the North African desert remain as relevant as ever. Preparation matters, adaptability matters, and above all, the human spirit, when tested by extreme circumstances, possesses capacities that exceed what careful planning and rational calculation would predict.